Welcome back everybody to the second day of the Twits. So here's the contents page. Yesterday we read Happy Hairy Faces, not Happy Faces, Mr. Twit and Dirty Beards. So we read the first three. Today we're going to read Mrs. Twit, the Glass Eye and the Frogs. We're going to read 3 chapters today, because they're quite short chapters, and hopefully that way if we read about 2 or 3 chapters a day we might get the book finished in 2 weeks. That's 10 days of listening to it 5 days a week. So let's get started, shall we? So today we are learning all about Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity, because she didn't, because at any rate it would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. So here's the picture of her here. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit, she wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would this happen? Well, I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when a person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier, until it gets so ugly that you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts can never be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, a crooked mouth, a double chin, sticky out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried her walking stick. She used to tell people this is because she had warts growing on the soles of her left foot and walking could be painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so she could hit things with. Things like dogs and cats, and things like small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. So far we've learned all about Mrs. Twit, and she seems to not be such a nice character, just like her husband. But I do agree, again, think she's quite an interesting character. So let's read on. The glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out. You can pop it back in again anytime you like. You bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into a mug of Mr. Twit's beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking his beer slowly. The froth made a white ring around the hairs on his mouth. He wiped the froth on his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. You're plotting something, Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so she wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. Whenever you go quiet, I know very well you're plotting something. Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. You better be careful, Mrs. Twit said, because I see you're starting to plot. I watch you like a wombat. Oh, do shut up, you old hag, Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer. His evil mind kept working away at his latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring at him from the bottom of the mug, and it made him jump. I told you I was watching you, cackled Mrs. Twit. I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful. So, Mr. and Mrs. Twit are actually not very nice to each other either. What do they like to do to each other? They like to play tricks on each other, don't they? Now, some tricks can sometimes be funny, but these tricks are not very nice tricks, are they? Let's see what is going to happen next. Now, Mr. Twit was thinking up an evil trick, so let's see if we're going to find out what his trick is next. This chapter is called The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided to put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed. Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets and then got into his own bed, waiting for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed, and she put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was always itchy. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed, "Ah!" "Oh, what's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" cried Mrs. Twit, bouncing around. "There's something in my bed." "Oh, I bet it's that giant skillywigger I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet." "Oh, it'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a cold jug of water. He poured it over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her, which means to help bring her around because she's fainted. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping around on the pillow. Frogs love water, and this one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. Now, this is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "Oh, by golly, it's a giant skillywigger," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and slept the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Now, that's the end of our 3 chapters today. So, yesterday we had the character Mr. Twit, and today we met Mrs. Twit. Very good. So, both characters, not that nice characters. They're horrid. They don't look after themselves. They don't really wash, and they're not really that nice characters. But like I said, I think they're really interesting characters. So, what do Mr. and Mrs. Twit like to do to each other? They're not very nice to each other. They like to play tricks on each other, don't they? They're tricksters. And like I said, sometimes it's not so bad to play a trick on someone, but to keep doing it actually isn't that nice. So, we've met the main 2 characters in our story. Now, I wonder what we're going to what's going to happen next. That's what we're going to find out tomorrow. Now, here is the hat that I'm wearing, my Rollie bird hat, which we haven't met the Rollie bird yet, and I took a photograph of it here for you to see. Just in case you maybe wanted to make your own Rollie bird hat. Now, what I did with the feathers is, you can see that I have folded a piece of paper in half, and then I cut out a shape of the feather on one side, and then I've cut like a little fringe. So down here, there's lots of little lines. And I've cut them all. Okay, so maybe you can make your own feathers on Rollie bird mask, or if you don't want to do that, maybe you could draw a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit, or one of them. I look forward to seeing your lovely pictures or your Rollie bird feathers from today, and I can't wait to come back tomorrow to read the rest of the story. Bye for now.